Hi guys and ladies, welcome back to semester 2 of PHP Fundamentals. So in the first semester, I really wanted to focus on the basics. So I wanted to teach you the language, how to work with files, how to wrap your mind around how PHP works. But what we did not take a look at is the process of working with databases. And truthfully, if you're building dynamic websites, which you will, databases are going to be something that you work with day in and day out. So for the next handful of lessons, we actually won't be working with PHP. We're instead going to be working with MySQL. All right, so let's get into it. The first thing I want to do is open up MAMP and go to the start page. Or alternatively, you can visit this URL right here. Next, I'm going to visit phpMyAdmin. So this is a simple web app built in PHP, by the way, that allows us to work with databases. And if you're still confused with the idea of databases, well, just think of them as places to store information. So let's say a blog like Touch Plus or NetTouch Plus. Well, we have lots of postings there. Well, where are we storing those? Well, we're storing them within a database. Within the database, we have a table for our posts, and every single post gets its own row. So simply think of a database as a convenient way to store information. And it also gives us a way to query that information however we want. Maybe we want to return posts that were created by myself. Or maybe you want to delete all posts that were created by a specific author. Things like that. And with databases and MySQL, or some people say MySQL, both work just fine. That gives us the ability to do so. Now, before we work with PHPMyAdmin, we're first going to take a look at the terminal usage. So I'm going to bring up the terminal. And by the way, if you want to get this style that I have, we have a posting on Touch Plus called A Visual Guide to Styling the Terminal in Minutes. And this will give you a quick video overview of how I set up my machine. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to go back to the terminal and we're going to boot up MySQL. So if I type MySQL right here, I want you to notice that it immediately logged us in. Welcome to MySQL. But this is generally considered a bad practice. When you're working locally on your personal computer, it's not as much of an issue, but you want to get in the habit of locking these things down because as it is right now, anyone could get on your computer or if they could access it through your network and log in and view information in your database. So the way that we can log into MySQL but provide a username and password is to do this. I will hit Control-C to log out, and now if I type MySQL -u, that's the username, and by default on the Mac it's going to be root. Next we're going to specify that we want to pass a password, and now we can enter that. Again, on the Mac this will be set to root, likely. If you're on Windows, I believe the password will be blank, so you would just hit return. Here I'll type root, and notice that we have logged in. So now we know that the username is root and the password is root or an empty string, but that will just log us right in. So as a first step to fixing this, let's simply take that root user and we'll eventually get off that root name because that's generally a bad practice. Instead, it's better to have specific users that only have access to specific databases. But for now, I don't want to overflow you. Let's just assign a unique password to the root user. And we can do that in a variety of different ways. We can use a command called setPassword. We can grant usage. There's lots of different ways, and I'll have some links here that you can review in the show notes. For now, I'm going to write setPassword. And whose password are we going to set? Well, we need to pass in the username and the host. And in this case, the host is localhost. So we're going to set a password for the root user at localhost. Next, what is that password going to be? Well, we will run this through the password function, and I'm going to give it a password of Touch Plus. Naturally, you will want yours to be a little bit more secure, but that's okay. It's easy to remember in this case. And I'm going to end this command with a semicolon. We've written our first bit of SQL. Set password for the root user at localhost, and that value is going to be equal to the string Touch Plus, and we're running it through the password function. Now if I hit return and everything went as expected, we get this query okay. Good. So now I'm going to log out. I'm just going to hit Control-C, or I can type exit. Now if we try it again, MySQL-u for user is root, and the password, and I'm going to type that in, Touch Plus. There we go, and now we're logged in. So there are lots of apps available that'll make it really easy to view your tables, but I want to give you just a brief overview of how to use it from the command line. And in fact, you'll find a lot of developers only use the command line. What you do will be up to you, of course. Well, first, I simply want to see what databases are available. And I want you to think of a database as a container for a project. So maybe you have a blog. Well, that database would be the blog. And within that database, you would have lots of tables. A table for the comments, a table for the users, a table to contain all of your blog postings, a table to contain tags for the website. Each of those are their own entities, but they're all contained within that one blog database. So if we want to view the databases, I'm going to write show databases and end it with a semicolon. Now what you'll see here is just some databases that were automatically created. So we have the information schema, the performance schema, and MySQL. These are system databases that you really won't need to touch at all. Next, we have this test one, and it's just a test database. It may or may not be available depending upon your OS and how you installed MySQL. For now, we're going to ignore it. So let's begin by creating our first database. And this database can be anything. It's not something we're going to use throughout the project. It's just something to get us started. So maybe we will go with that blog idea. So we can create a database by doing create database. And what is the name of the database? It is going to be called blog. Now notice I'm using all lowercase. You can do that. The technical way should be to use uppercase, but it really doesn't matter. And when you're doing this all of the time, you'll find that you keep it lowercase. But if you want it to be more readable, you can use the special keywords as all uppercase. So we could do create database and blog, semicolon, and now we have a query OK, which means that was executed successfully. Now I'm going to hit Command K to clear the screen. And if I type show databases again, now we can see that we have this new blog database. Now I'm going to toggle transparency by pressing Command U in iTerm, and that way you don't have to see the background. But now at this point we are looking at all the databases, but I want to use a specific one. So I want to say use, or you could do uppercase. We're going to use blog. And that simply means the current database that I'm working with is now blog. So now at this point, we have the container. Think of the database as the house, and then within it, you have all of these different layers, which are the tables. So let's view the tables by writing show tables. But of course, we haven't created any tables yet, so let's do that now. We're going to begin by creating a table for our users. And ultimately, this would be, for example, the users that can log into the back end. So this is information about specific user accounts. So I'm going to create a new table by writing create table and then the name of the table. In this case, we're going to call it users. Notice that I'm using the plural form. It's not user, it's a table of users. Now, within parentheses, I'm going to specify the information about this table. So for example, first I need an ID, and this is something I want you to get in the habit of. Every table you create should have a unique identifier. I could say, get me the row from the users table where the ID is 10. And because that ID will always be unique, you know that it will correspond specifically to one user and one user only. So this is fairly standard. We're going to refer to the field as ID. Next, we need to specify, well, what kind of field is it? Is it a variable number of characters? Is it an integer? Is it a date? Would it be a small integer, which you would think of for Boolean values? Well, in this case, it's an integer, so I'm going to type int. Next, because I know I want this to be unique, the easiest way to do that is for every new row, we want to auto-increment the ID. So if you create a new row and the last row's ID was 10, well then we wanted to automatically apply an ID of 11 to that new row. And we can do that by typing auto-increment like that. Next, let's specify the other parameters. Well, a user should have a first name, right? So we'll specify it like that. And I'm going to say it can be a variable number of characters, but 50 max sounds good. That means it won't take up any more space than it needs to, but we are setting a limit of 50 characters. Next, I'm going to require a first name. So we will write not null, meaning the first name field cannot be empty. All right, let's do another one. Last name, essentially going to be the exact same thing. Varchar 50, not null. Next, I'm going to have a section for the email address, and I'm going to make that a little bit larger just to be safe. That's 100. And I'm going to require that one as well. Generally, you will want things to be not null, but you can imagine maybe a user's table would have a bio, but that could be optional, so you wouldn't add not null, because we're not going to require everyone to have a bio. But in this case, I think what we have here is fine. Ideally, in a real-world situation, your users table would probably have more fields. For example, a users table should probably have fields for when the account was created or when the account was last updated. Another one you might add would be a field which determines whether the user is active or not. Maybe, for example, it's a membership system like Touch Plus, where you will have your users, but unless that user's account is set to active, we don't want to give them access to things. So you could have an enabled or active field. Maybe it's possible that the user has an activation code field, and that would be when they sign up for an account, you set a unique activation code. That code is sent to the user via email, and then when they click on that link, that's how we can confirm that their email address was created correctly. But for now, let's not overwhelm you. Let's keep it like that. So I'm going to close this out with the final parentheses and semicolon. However, before I press return, there's one thing we need to do. We need to specify the primary key. So I will do that right here, primary key, and that's going to be the ID field like that. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter. And whoops, it looks like we had an error. And this is something you'll probably come across a lot. SQL is very specific in how you add it. So if we take a look, notice that I accidentally forgot a comma after the email field. So I'm going to hit up to go to the last command I wrote, and we'll just use the left arrow key to move back a few steps, and we'll add a comma after not null right there. Let's try it one more time. And now we can see query OK, rows affected. So now I'm going to hit Command K to clear the screen, and I will write show tables one more time. And now we have this new table, users. But what if I want to see how it's created? What is it made up of? Well, I'm going to describe users. And now we can see, okay, we have this helpful table. So we have 4 fields, ID, first name, last name, and email address. We know the ID is an integer. The others can accept variable characters. That way we won't set aside more space than we need. We know that none of these fields can be empty. We know that the ID is a primary key, and more on that shortly. All of them have a default of null. Now, there are some times when you will want to set a default null maybe of 0 or a specific value, but that's not necessary in this case. And then finally, for extras, we know that we want to auto-increment the ID every time a new row is created. Now back to that primary key section. What does primary key mean? Well, that is the way that we ensure that the field that it corresponds to, in this case it will usually be ID, that's how we ensure that it will have to be unique. Because it obviously doesn't help if we have 2 users which have the same ID. We need a unique identifier for the row, and that's what primary key does. If it helps, just think of it from the sense of a primary key makes sure that no 2 IDs can have the same value. And of course, that's why we've set the auto increment option. That way, for every new row, the ID will be increased by 1. All right, so that's going to do it for this lesson. I'm going to hit Control-C to back out and do recap. To log in, we do MySQL-U, give it the username, and the password is going to be Touch Plus in our case. Next, we're going to show the databases that are available. Okay, I want to use blog in this case. Next, I'm going to show the tables. We also learned how to describe a table using the describe keyword. Looks good. And then the final thing I'm going to leave you with, which we will talk about in the next lesson, is selecting rows. So I could say select star, which means select everything from the users table. Now if I run that, we're going to get an empty set because we have a table, but we don't have anything within it, no rows yet. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next lesson. I'll see you there.